Alright, it's recording. Greetings. My name is Marco. I'm your servant in Jesus Christ. And in this video, I'm gonna do essentially a complete overview of the book of Revelation. This was meant for Shaman CF last Wednesday. However, I didn't get to go into too much of what I wanted to convey, just purely due to the time constraints. But there are things that I still wanted to convey. So for those of you who are using this video, watching this video, I hope this becomes kind of a tool or a guideline for you as you attempt to go through the book of Revelation, not simply to dictate your interpretation of the book. So with that said, do forgive me if I made a lot of mistakes. This is going to be done in one shooting, and I'm kind of alone in setting all these up. So please bear with me if I do make mistakes, and I'm going to stick to my script mostly. So that there's going to be minimum mistakes. With that, let's dive into the book. So the book of Revelation, of course, begins with a title. Let's delve in. The title begins with the apocalypse of Jesus Christ. When we think about that word, the word apocalypse, we think about things like a zombie apocalypse or maybe the movie 2012. And that's mostly because of Hollywood influence, because of modern pop culture influence on us. When John wrote the book, there was no such influence, of course. And so, apocalypse simply means an uncovering or an unveiling. It comes from the word apo, which means away from, and kalupto, which means a cover or a veil. Together they mean to take out of hiding or to disclose secrets. This is, of course, fitting with the translation, the revelation, because it is to uncover, to unveil, to reveal. And so with that, we have kind of an ambiguous title, however. It could have a double meaning. It could mean that Jesus is the thing that is being revealed, or that Jesus himself is unveiling secrets to us. We know from the Gospel of John that he is fond of double meaning, in a sense where he would use a word which would have two meanings, and both meanings would work in a particular context. So the question becomes, what does the title truly mean? And I believe that the title could mean both, definitely. That Jesus himself is the person that is being unveiled, and yet at the same time, Jesus is unveiling secrets to John. And so let's get into the secrets that is about to be unveiled. First, John is taken up into heaven, and he is shown the control room of the universe. Later, John will see a monster, a picture of the Roman Empire, which of course doesn't look or act like a monster. Later, John will see a woman in the desert. This is the city Jerusalem. She's named Babylon. Of course, Jerusalem doesn't think of itself as a harlot, but John sees the secret of Jerusalem, that it is a prostitute that has gone after other gods. And then the second secret, of course, is about Jesus himself. And the question becomes how? Let's take a look at the structure of the book. Now, we have to realize that the book of Revelation is oddly shaped, considering its title. When we watch a movie that is about a conflict, we would think that it would climax in a fight scene. When we watch a comedy, of course, it would end with happiness, with a happy scene, oftentimes a wedding. When we watch a mystery, a detective story, it often ends with the criminal being revealed. In that sense, the book of Revelation is lopsided. The first thing that John sees is Jesus unveiled. He was in the Spirit on the Lord's day in Revelation 1 verse 10. He hears a voice behind him, and then he turns around and he sees the glorified Son of Man. He sees Jesus with his face shining like sun. He sees Jesus with his head and hair white. He sees Jesus with his feet like molten metal, his eyes they are burning, and a sword coming out of his mouth. He sees Jesus with 7 stars on his hand. Jesus has been unveiled before chapter 1 even ends. It's like a joke where the punchline is being delivered at the beginning of the joke. Usually that wouldn't work. It's as if the criminal has already been revealed in the beginning of the story. Something odd is happening. something unusual is happening in the book of Revelation. And to find out why or how, we should take a deeper look at how the book segments itself. Now, there are a lot of ways that the book of Revelation can be segmented. There are portions of sevens, and which we can definitely go into in a lot of the chiasmus that happens. But before anything else, I think it's best to segment the book the way the book segments itself, obviously. The book itself is organized around 4 visions, and these 4 visions begin or are marked by the phrase, in the Spirit. In Revelations 1:10, John is in the Spirit on the Lord's day. In Revelations 4 verse 2, he is in spirit in the heavens. And in Revelation 17:3, John is in the Spirit and he is taken down to the wilderness. And in Revelations 21 verse 10, he is taken up in spirit to a high mountain. Each one marks a new vision. And first, John sees Jesus, and Jesus dictates to him the letters to the 7 churches from chapter 1 to 3. Then he is swept up to heaven, and he sees Jesus as the lion and the lamb, and then he sees a series of 7. He opens a book with 7 seals. He sees 7 angels trumpet out 7 trumpets. And then John receives the book, eats it, and then speaks its content, from chapter 12 to 15. And then 7 bowls are poured out on the earth. This is the central vision, the second vision. Then he is taken into the desert, and he sees the city Babylon, which is Jerusalem, as the harlot, and the destruction of the harlot city. Then Jesus is on a triumphal procession with his army. Satan is bound at the beginning of the millennium, and then he sees the final judgment and the descent of the new Jerusalem as the new creation and the new earth. If this truly was about the unveiling of Jesus, we could end as early as chapter 5. In chapter 5, Jesus is already unveiled as the glorious Son of Man and as the lion and the lamb in heaven. The last 2 visions doesn't have much to do with Jesus. They're not about the last Adam, they're not about the Son of Man, but they're about 2 women, the harlot, the false bride, and the New Jerusalem, the true bride. Well, Jesus is unveiled in the book of Revelation. There is a coronation at the end of the book, but it's not the coronation of Jesus himself. The one who receives crowns at the end of the book are the saints and the martyrs who share the sufferings of Jesus and therefore share his glory. And that's where we begin, that the glory of the martyrs is the unveiling of the glory of Jesus. Perhaps we can say in another way. We can say that Jesus is glorified by the glorification of his bride. Paul says that the woman is the glory of the man. That's true for every man. It's true for the first Adam. And it's true for Jesus, the last Adam. Because the church is Jesus' bride. And the church is the glory of the last Adam. In this sense, the book of Revelation never moves out of Genesis 2. Jesus is the last Adam. And the book is about the formation of a new Eve, the church, from the trauma and the surgery of martyrdom that happens in the book of Revelation. It is the new Eve formed from the side and the rib of the last Adam. And so, as you can see, the Bible now presents this one big chiasmus where we revert back to a story that resembles Genesis 2. Now, let's go into the timing of the book. The apostles are always warning in the New Testament about a coming catastrophe. We see something of a similar theme in the book of Revelation. Revelation 3:1, where it is said that the time is near. Later on in Revelation 22:6, it is said again that these are the things that must shortly take place. Many people interpret this differently. Some say it's not actually near, that it could be thousands of years down the line. Some liberal scholar says that Jesus actually lied, that he said that he would come and he didn't. I think, of course, we should opt for the clearest option, which is that the catastrophic event that is portrayed in the book of Revelation is near and is within the generation of the apostles, not ours. there is a consistency of theme within the apostle, because Jesus taught it mainly in the Olivet Discourse, where all the disciples heard from him. I'll read to you a portion from Matthew 24 itself, verse 34, whereby Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." This warning takes place at the end of Matthew 23 and 24, where Jesus warns the people of his day that the blood of the martyrs, of the prophets, will be avenged upon Israel, and that the temple will be destroyed, that not one stone will be left upon one another. Now, another thing is that we see Jesus in Matthew 24 talk about a collapse of a physical universe, it seems. He uses language like the stars blinking out, the stars falling from the sky, the moon turning to blood, and the sun going black. And we think that because of that, Jesus is talking about the fall of a physical, the collapse of a physical universe. He's talking about a cosmic catastrophe. But Jesus is actually borrowing standard prophetic language, language often used to talk about the collapse of an imperial world or a world order, by using hyperbole and talking about the collapse of a physical universe. An example is Isaiah 13, verse 9 to 10, where he says, "Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land a desolation, and to destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light." This took place long before Jesus was around, long before the New Testament, and yet the universe has not collapsed as it is. But we know that Babylon has been destroyed. We know that Egypt has been destroyed. They are judged, and the things that Yahweh cursed upon them has come about. Another example is, of course, Isaiah 19, verse 1, an oracle concerning Egypt. "Behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud, and comes to Egypt. And the idols of Egypt will tremble at his presence, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them. The waters of the sea will be dried up, and the river will be dry and parched. And its canals will become foul, and the branches of Egypt's Nile will diminish and dry up. Reeds and rushes will rot away." Of course, no sea has dried up, not because God lied, but because he did come, he did judge. But when he was warning them, he was using this hyperbolic language to warn the nations. And so the question becomes, which world is destroyed then? Which world specifically? And I think it's quite clear. The world of Jesus' generation, which includes the Second Temple, the new priesthood after the exile under the Roman imperial order. This is the world that is about to be destroyed, which includes the entire Mediterranean. This is the oikoumene that is collapsing, the system that is going to end. And the first few chapters of the book of Revelation is then preparing the churches for that collapse. How can the church flourish in times of upheaval? When the world around it is collapsing, how can it continue to serve Jesus and expand his kingdom? And so we'll begin to take a look at the messages to the seven churches. And so, I'll stick here. Now, these churches, the seven churches in the book of Revelation, are in the in-between place. They are in the marginal place. They are between Jerusalem and the center of the Roman Empire, the Asia Minor. And the premise is that they are not prepared for the coming of Jesus, the collapse of the world. And so the messages to the seven churches has a premise that they need to be prepared. But the question is how? Jesus is constantly warning them against the porneia. That word is often translated as sexual immorality, which at face value is true. The church should not indulge in sexual immorality. But in the book of Revelation, there's a specific context. Porneia is connected to alliances or dalliances with the porne, or the harlot, the city harlot, which is Jerusalem. And so porneia in this context is not just sexual immorality, but it has to do with infidelity, unfaithfulness. The Christians are facing pressures, and the Jews are persecuting them. And the Romans will soon start to persecute them as well. It seems like the safe thing to do is to enter into alliance with Judaism, to find safety in Jerusalem, to search out the harlot, and find protection under the auspices of the Jews. Jesus is telling them to not do that. Do not compromise with the old world that is passing away. It might look safe, but it's not. Jesus also warns them about eating meat sacrificed to idol. This is a warning to not compromise the other direction. They're not supposed to compromise with Judaism and revert back to the old covenant. They're also not supposed to compromise with the Roman order, because sacrificing to idols are part of the civic order of Rome. If you partake in idolatrous feasts and temple sacrifices, you will be considered as a citizen of Rome. You will get protection. Jesus tells them to not compromise in either direction. Jesus addresses the churches through the angel of the church. Some say that it's the guardian angel or the spirit angel, but that wouldn't make any sense, would it? Because Jesus wouldn't need to tell John to write physical letters to angels. Jesus could just address the angels himself. These angelos are exactly by the word's definition messengers. The angels of the seven churches could simply be the pastors or the elders of the seven churches. And Jesus holds them responsible for clearing the church from heresy, from immorality, from compromise. These are all the ways that Jesus tells the churches to be prepared for the collapse of the world. Though these messages were specific to the first century church, it does still ring true to us to some degree. When we see our world system in upheaval, seeming to decay, we should take those messages to heart. We should not seek safety in an empire. We should not seek safety in a false church, but relentlessly hold to Jesus. And that's the only way the church will survive and flourish in times of upheaval. Now, after the message to the seven churches, we begin to see visions in heaven. Now, John is currently exiled in the island of Patmos because of his witness to Jesus. And then he sees a door, a voice calls out to him, and then he enters. And then he finds himself in a throne room. There is an enthroned one who looks like gemstones. These are not just any gemstones. These are specific gemstones. They remind us of the gemstones of the royal tribes of Israel in Exodus 28. And those gemstones are meant to remind us of the Davidic kings. He sees a sea, like the one in the temple courts, one that looks like crystal in Solomon's temple in 1 Kings 7. He also sees 24 thrones surrounding the one throne at the center. This reminds us of the 24 courses of priests that David sets up for the temple in 1 Chronicles 24. Then John sees four living creatures that have a face of the ox, a face of an eagle, a face of a man, and a face of a lion. These are the faces of the cherubim that Ezekiel saw in the vision by the river Kivar in Ezekiel 1 verse 28. All the things that John sees reminds us of the temple's design. But remember, the temple is meant to be a copy. God shows Moses a heavenly pattern and tells the people to build a tabernacle. He showed David a vision of heaven, and then David tells Solomon to build the temple. The tabernacle and the temple is meant to be a copy of heaven. What John is seeing now is not just another copy. John is seeing the original, as we are now caught up into heaven alongside with John, and he is now standing right before the original of the ark. Now, this vision of heaven might seem like a reprieve. It might seem like a break from the tension that is happening on earth. But John finds something wrong even in heaven. There's a book on the right side of the enthroned one. There's supposed to be a king there. But there's only a book, and the book is sealed. John sees that and begins to lament. He begins to weep loudly because a search was made and no one is found that can open the book. No one in heaven, no one on earth, no one under the earth. John laments because this is the book of the kingdom. Without anyone to open the book, the kingdom cannot come. This is the book that was sealed at the end of Daniel, the one Daniel sealed at the end of his prophecies. Without anyone to open the book, the prophecies will never be fulfilled. This is the book of conquest, the one that Joshua held. Without anyone to open, the conqueror will not conquer. But while John laments, he was told that the lion from the tribe of Judah has come. And when he turns around, he sees a lamb. In that doubleness, we see the double nature of Jesus. Jesus is both the sacrificial lamb who offers himself for our sins, and he's the avenging lion who takes revenge on our enemies, as we see later on in the book of Revelation. Before Jesus appears, the 24 elders were already worshipping, but when Jesus showed up in heaven, they began to sing. They suddenly have harps. They were saying praise, but now they are singing praise. Suddenly they have bowls of incense, and the prayer of the saints are ascending to the throne, because Jesus is in heaven, and the prayers of the saints can now get to the Father. Before he sees 7 spirits burning before the throne like 7 torches. But as soon as Jesus appears, those 7 spirits become the 7 eyes of the Lamb. When we piece all these things together, we realize that what John is watching is actually the ascension of Jesus. First, he was not in heaven, now he is in heaven. On the day of Pentecost, Peter says that he has received the Spirit, which Jesus poured out from the church. John has seen Jesus depart from earth, and now in the Spirit, John is privileged to see the ascension from the other side of the firmament, and to see Jesus begin to open the book. Now that we know the crucial timing of the book of Revelation, the book is telling us the things that are about to take place. But remember, it's a sequential narrative. Right now, what we are actually seeing are actually things that has already happened during John's lifetime. So now we know when the narrative of the vision began. We know whatever happens in chapter 6 must be something that follows the ascension of Jesus. Now, obviously, the most obvious thing that follows the ascension of Jesus is the pouring out of the Spirit. Jesus began opening the 4 seals, and the 4 horsemen came out. That 4 horsemen must be something that follows the ascension of Jesus. What could it be? Some people say it's the Antichrist because it brings chaos and division, but I don't think that's true. Again, like I said, the most obvious thing that follows Christ's ascension is the Pentecost, and I think that's what the 4 horsemen represents. As the Lamb opens the seals, the Spirit that was burning before the throne is now unleashed like riders, and the Spirit goes out as the rider of the horse, and their horse is the church, the saints, the believers. This is a familiar imagery for those who are acquainted with the Old Testament. Zechariah 10 verse 3, Yahweh tells Israel that he will make Israel like his noble steed, that Israel is the war horse of Yahweh. In the same sense now, the church becomes the war horse of the Spirit. And as the Spirit goes out, the things that the 4 horsemen represents happens on earth. The first horse is a white horse. It's a horse of conquest that tells the victorious message of the gospel. The second is a red horse, which brings division and conflict. The rider is given a sword because whenever the gospel goes out, it creates division among men. Jesus even said that it'll create division among families. Then the Spirit goes out on a black horse, which brings a partial famine, a famine of wheat and of barley, but a preservation of oil and wine. Some things are diminished, some things are preserved. As the Jewish side loses capital and the church gains capital, the final horseman comes out, and this horseman was given the authority to kill with sword, famine, pestilence, and of wild beasts of the earth. Revelation 6:8 reminds us then of Ezekiel 14:21, that where God gives Israel 4 judgments. And what would you know? It is the exact same thing that the fourth horseman represents: to kill with the sword, of famine, pestilence, and of wild beasts of the earth. When those who continue to resist the gospel, continue to resist Christ, there will be a final judgment. This will be true of Israel because they have denied Christ, denied the gospel, and denied the apostles. And now God will judge Israel. This is an image that happened throughout Acts. In the book of Acts, they recorded it in a more historical narrative sense. But as the Spirit goes out riding the church, bringing the vision, and finally death to those who resist, so that the world could be changed and transformed into the kingdom of the Lord. Now, we enter into the story, which is one of the most pivotal story in the book of Revelation, that is of the martyrs and of the prayer of the martyrs. The Lamb opens now the fifth seal, and he sees a vision of souls poured out under the altar, the same bronze altar in the courtyard of the temple, where sin offerings are presented, and the blood of the sin offerings are poured out on the base of the altar, so that the animal can ascend in smoke to the presence of the Lord. The book says that these are the souls that has been slain for their witness. It's clear who these people are. These are martyrs. They are crying out for vindication. So we'll read Revelation 6, verse 10 to 11. They cried out with a loud voice, "O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth?" Then they were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer, until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were to be killed as they themselves had been. So the souls that we see under the altar are crying out, and they're crying out for vindication. They're using the same word that the prophets would use back in their day. They're crying out, "How long, O Lord?" This is an imprecatory prayer. How long, O Lord? You, Lord, act on behalf of your people. You, Lord, speak on behalf of your people. Lord, when will you judge your enemies and avenge our blood? And John here sees a vision of assurance, but also of disappointment for the souls of on the altar. They're given a white robe, a promise that they will be vindicated. But the disappointing part is that it will have to wait, that there must be more martyrs before they can ascend. That tells us who these martyrs are specifically. Jesus said in Matthew 23, verse 33 to 36, in his series of woes against the Jews, "You serpents, you brood of vipers, how are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some who will flog you in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." It's quite clear who Jesus is making the Israelites responsible for. These are the Old Testament martyrs. Jesus charged them to being responsible of the death of the Old Testament martyrs. But before the souls of the Old Testament martyrs can ascend, there must be more martyrs made. The New Testament martyrs must join them. Only when their blood is shed can they all be exalted, and they will all be exalted and join the heavenly hosts and singing praises to the Lamb. Now, another angel goes out and seals 144,000 saints on their forehead. These 144,000 are taken from the tribes of Israel, 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes, and I think we should take that properly, that these are Jewish martyrs. They are marked on the forehead. They are like priests in the temple who offer sacrifice, but they are also marked as the sacrifice. They are the priesthood, and their priesthood is like the one of Jesus Christ. Jesus is both priest, the one who offers the sacrifice, and the one who offers himself as a sacrifice. This 144,000 will now join in Jesus' suffering and become their own priest of their own sacrifice. The book of Revelation, among many other things, is a theology of martyrdom. Because of this, it's relevant to every age. Even though some events are specific in John's lifetime, it is showing truths about witness and martyrdom in every age. Even today, Christians are in jail for their witness. Pastors around the world are tortured, they can't get jobs, mobs tear down their places of worship. And the message of Revelation is that the Lord pays attention to those who witness faithfully. He does not leave the blood of his martyrs unavenged. Even for us in the comfortable peninsula, Revelation has a message for us. We don't suffer much like our brothers and sisters do throughout the world, but we do have various kinds of pressure as well. The Greek word for witness is martus or martyria. When we witness faithfully under the midst of family pressure, in the midst of corrupted business practices at work, or in the midst of an unfaithful church, then we are acting as martyrs, boldly witnessing and holding his word in the face of opposition. The worst that anyone can do is kill a Christian. But when a Christian is killed, they join the sufferings of Jesus, and their blood becomes the blood that brings God's wrath against his enemies. This kind of witness is indefeasible. It is undefeatable. Those who are courageous witness in whatever setting will be victorious because they join in the suffering and victory of Jesus. In Revelation 8, we see the final seal being opened, and there was silence in heaven for half an hour. I'm going to read it. When the Lamb opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. Then I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. And another angel came and stood at the altar with a golden censer. And he was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. And the smoke of the incense, with the prayers of the saints, rose before God from the hand of the angel. Then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and threw it on the earth. And there were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. And so, after we see the judgment of the 7 seals, we see, after the last seal is being opened, we see judgment. We see that the world is starting to become decreated. But of course, this is not the decreation of the physical universe. This is the decreation of Judaism, of the world in Jesus' day. Now, throughout, we will see that more throughout the trumpet section. But of course, as I read this, it reminds me of another thing. Let me find this image. So yeah, Jesus gives us the spiritual reality of our prayers. Now, and here we see that God silences heaven, and then the angel mixes the incense with the prayers of the saints, the same prayer we see earlier in chapter 6, crying out for vindication, so that it ascends to God and becomes like incense. It becomes like a sweet smell to God. And in verse 5, God responds to the prayers, to the cries for vindication, because we see then the angel takes a censer, fills it with fire, and threw it upon the earth. And then judgment began to take place on the earth. The world begins to be decreated. God is sovereign, and he determines how history plays out, but he does so using our prayers. Beloved, when I read this, again, it makes me stop and makes me realize and makes me ask myself, do I see my prayer life this way? Is this how I myself, is this how my attitude is towards prayer? Because before this, if you remember, Shaman CF often has morning prayer, AM prayer in the field, and usually the attitude is I have to drag myself there, and then I'll just drag myself back because I'm super tired and I just want to get this over with. But the book of Revelation doesn't treat prayer that way. John discloses to us the truth, the spiritual reality of our prayer. That when we pray, As, and as the saints prayed in the book of Revelation for vindication, it goes up. The angel mixes it with incense. It becomes like a sweet smell. It goes before God, and God responds to their cry of vindication. He cries, he avenges the blood of the saints by judging the world, and the world becomes decreated, and it begins to fall apart as an answer, the vindication of the saints. And so, again, when we read this book, it gives us an amazing vision. But remember that this is actually a vision of our spiritual practice, what our prayer actually looks like. And yet we are largely disinterested when it comes to gathering for prayer. And so I hope this part 2 reminds us of our spiritual practices that we often take for granted. And so now we move on to the trumpet judgments. So far we haven't seen the contents of the book. Remind you, Revelation is full of mystery, but it's not nonsense. Okay? If the book is sealed, then it cannot be read. The contents of the book will be announced later in the chapter, but in the book, as John eats, John will eat the book that is unsealed, and he will begin to spew its content. But again, that's going to be later on in the book. Right now, we're entering the trumpet section, which is still not the content of the sealed book. The trumpet acts as a fanfare, like in the Old Testament. It's like saying, "Hear ye, hear ye." We are now preparing to hear the contents of the book. And so, in the trumpet section, we are still seeing visions of things that actually took place during the book of Acts. The first 4 trumpets bring judgments on the 4 different zones of creation: the heavens, the earth, the seas, mimicking the days of creation. The second day of creation is the sea, and the second trumpet judges the waters in the land. Then the judgments on land, and the judgment on the heavenly bodies in the 4th day of creation. And on the 5th day of creation, in Genesis, God made all the swarming things. And the fifth trumpet brings out the crawling and the swarming things. We see a star fall from heaven into an abyss. It creates a smoke, and from the smoke comes out swarming things. This looks like a combination of Egyptian plagues. It's a plague of darkness. It's a plague of locusts. The creature from the smokes, though, are not merely locusts. These are composite creatures. They are locusts, they're scorpions, they're leucorpions, they ride horses, they have faces of men, they have hair like women. These are infernal cherubims, or demonic cherubims, as it were. I believe the image of the 5th trumpet is an image of an inverted temple. The temple is meant to be a stairway to heaven, a way so Israel could come to the presence of God in heaven, but instead the temple turned into its opposite. It becomes a stairway to the pit, and from this inverted temple flows out hordes of demons, stinging and causing pain, creating havoc throughout the land. Again, this is a vision of what is happening in Acts. The temple authorities and the Jewish leaders sending out troops to attack the apostles, troops to corrupt the church, which is being orchestrated in the temple. This sets up the conflict between the martyrs and the hordes inspired by Satan. When the 6th trumpet sounds, we see another group. Now, a lot of scholars think that this is another demonic group, but I don't think that would make much sense. If it's another demonic army, then this becomes a one-sided conflict. I think we should see this as an angelic army. For starters, it's numbered. There are 200 million of these armies, of these figures. Things that are numbered are often holy things. Things like the ark, the temple, the armies of Israel that are numbered. And their horses are fire-breathing. They breathe smoke and sulfur. But this could be a good thing. In Isaiah 30, the breath of Yahweh and his prophets are described like fire and sulfur. The prophets in the Old Testament are often described as fire-breathing. I think this is the fire-breathing power of the gospel that the apostles are proclaiming along with the angelic powers that accompany them. And so, now, as the trumpet sections conclude, we now see And we are now ready to see the contents of the book. John receives the book from an angelic figure. He receives it from an angel clothed with the sun, clothed with the cloud, his face shining like the sun. And the angel has an open book, which now he gives to John. John then receives the book, eats it, and then speaks its content. Before he does, he gets a preview of the vision of the book. We see a vision of a city, which is Jerusalem, that is called spiritually Sodom and Egypt. There is 2 witnesses in that city. It mimics the 2 angels in Sodom, or Moses and Aaron in Egypt. They are like Elijah and Elisha in the time of Ahab. Those 2 witnesses represent the Jews and Gentiles who together witness in the city. They are put to death, then they are revived in the city, and then the city is shaken. John will now show what is shortly to take place. 1. When John eats the book, he begins to see vision. And the first vision is of a woman who is giving birth. Now, let me follow my notes. Now, nearby the woman, there is a dragon, and the dragon is ready to devour her child. Now, the characters in the story are easy to define, at least 2 of them are. The dragon is called the serpent of old, who is called Satan and the devil later on in the book. The child is Jesus, who will ascend into heaven and rule with a rod of iron. It's a very short version of Jesus' ministry. He was born, and then he was taken up into heaven. The question is, who is the woman? Is it Eve? Is it Mary giving birth to Jesus? I think it's a broader vision than that. I think John is seeing the history of Israel. Israel has always had the vocation of being the mother of the seed, the one who brings the seed into the world. And this is the great birth story of Israel as it is gestating and giving birth to the Messiah. The baby is born, and he ascends into heaven, and the dragon's plan is foiled, like how Pharaoh failed to kill Moses, and Herod, who tried to kill baby Jesus, failed. The dragon was not able to devour the child when it was born. The dragon tries to attack the woman and her other children, but he keeps failing. The dragon is persistent. He insists on attacking the woman and her seed, and to do that, he will need help to attack the woman and her seed, and we'll see the company that he recruits to help him. First, the dragon is joined with the sea monster and a land monster, and this gives us a counterfeit trinity. It's a demonic trinity that begins to attack the saints. One of the beasts looks like a leopard, a bear, a lion. It's a composite animal, but it comes out from the sea, which is the significant indicator of who this beast is. In many places in the Old Testament, like Isaiah 60, the sea is equated to the Gentile nations. The beasts that we are seeing reminds us of the composite beasts in Daniel 7. They represent old Gentile empires, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and then Rome. What John is seeing is the last beast, which is the composite of all the beasts in Daniel 7. It comes from the sea, the Gentile world, and it will now attack the saints. This is the new thing that will shortly take place. Because up until this point, the Roman Empire has protected the church from Jewish persecution. Oftentimes, Paul appeals to his Roman citizenship when he is about to be prosecuted unjustly. And of course, the Christians don't see Rome as a sea beast, but now the Roman Empire will begin to attack the saints. This is what will shortly take place for the readers in John's time. The dragon also gets help from the land beast, which represents the Jewish persecutors, who now have turned into propagandists for the Roman Empire. We know because the beast has an identity marker. The number 666 is the number of Solomon's apostasy. The gold he gathered weighed 666 talents in 2 Chronicles 9 and 1 Kings 10. But it's also a numerical equivalent to Nero Caesar. Of course, there's not some kind of secret code to crack. It's simply called Gematria, and this is how the Hebrew language treats their numbers and names. That identity marker is placed on the forehead and the right hand of those who follow it. Now, Christian nowadays dare parallel modern invention like quantum tattooing with a verse in the Bible and call it interpreting scripture. Now, of course, this is not at all what the reader in John's day would have understood to be the mark of the beast. This should instead remind the people of John's day of another Old Testament scripture. It should remind them of Deuteronomy 6, verse 4 to 9. Let me read it. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit down in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Now, that talks about nothing like quantum tattoo. It talks about devotion. It talks about ownership. It indicates the one who they worship. Their thoughts, which is their forehead, and their deeds, their right hand, must be marked by love, because they worship God and God owns them. But instead, the Jewish leaders now devote themselves to 666, to Nero Caesar. It is said later on in Revelations 13, verse 12, that the land beast orders its followers to worship the first beast, the Roman beast. And it's said later on as well that the false prophet creates an imagery of the beast, for the beast, which is, I believe, a reference to Herod's temple, which was supposed to be devoted to the worship of God, now turned into a mouthpiece for Roman propaganda, for the bloodthirsty persecution of the church. Now, we see the alliance of Rome and Judaism against the church, and I think we should see this as a parallel force in the conflict. Jesus brings about a new humanity by combining Jew and Gentile, making them the church, and the mirror image of that, the counterfeit image of that, is this alliance of what was Rome and what was Judaism now attacking the church. The counterfeit humanity now attacks the church, and although this is an image that tells us about the first century, it teaches us what to expect in every century of the church's age. The idolatry of the state is a common thing today, but whenever we see the idolatry of the state, whenever we see a sea monster arise, we also see a land monster, a counterfeit church that supports the sea beast, and a bloodthirsty political order. Whenever there is persecution from the state, there will always be false Christians, counterfeit Christians, cheering them on as they attack the true saints. But we know from the book of Revelation that this alliance will fail. The sea beast and the land beast, inspired by the dragon, are not able to overcome the saints ultimately. Many saints die, but their blood is shed, and their blood becomes the catalyst for the fall of the city and the beginning of a new world that will descend from heaven. Now, we see then a scene that will mimic the Exodus, and it will be the Exodus of the martyrs. Now, at the beginning of Revelation chapter 14, the martyrs show up again. These are the same martyrs as the one marked as the 144,000. They're no longer at the base of the altar. They're now at Mount Zion. They're no longer distant from God. The Lamb is now among them. They're not yet wearing white robes. They're not yet in heaven joining the heavenly choir, but they are beginning to learn the song of heaven as they prepare for their martyrdom. Revelation 14 ends with a harvest scene. One like a son of man rides through the scene on a cloud, wearing a golden crown with a sharp sickle on his hand, and with that sickle he gathers the grain and the grapes. Now, many people misunderstand this harvest scene as a judgment scene, a judgment against the wicked. But we need to read it in the context of the whole chapter. In the beginning of the chapter, the ones who are called the first fruits of the harvest are the 144,000. They are the grain and the grapes that will be harvested by Jesus at the end of the chapter. Jesus will now come forth and harvest his own people and rescue them from persecution. From earth, martyrdom looks horrendous. It involves torture, mockery, and even sometimes involves death. But from a heavenly perspective, we see Jesus is rescuing his people like a harvest. And now that they've been whisked up into heaven, they join the heavenly choir and they've been given instruments. They began singing the Song of Moses. This tells us what this is. This is an Exodus-like event. They've been rescued from the dragon, the beast, and began to rejoice like Israel did after the Exodus through the Red Sea. Now, again, in chapter 14 to 16, we see a vision where the saints and the martyrs are portrayed as the grain and the grapes, as the people who have eaten the bread and the wine, and they themselves have become first fruits like Jesus. They become like bread and wine for the world, and the martyrs as the grapes of God are put then into the winepress, and their blood is shed, and this blood will then be used to sprinkle the earth in a sevenfold manner. There's a sprinkling on the earth, there's a sprinkling on the sea, there's a sprinkling on the sun, and eventually a sprinkling on the air. When the blood is sprinkled on the air, everything begins to fall apart. There's an earthquake, there's a thunder, there's hailstorm with hailstones such as never been seen. God's throne is starting to come to earth, and all this happens because of the martyrs, because they have not loved their life even unto death. The kingdoms of this world becomes the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, because the martyrs have shed their blood in union with Jesus Christ, and the throne of God has come upon the earth. Whenever martyrs shed their blood on earth, a world is shaken down, and a new world emerges. This is the power of bold witness. This is the power of martyrdom. And at this point, it kind of hit me. And I often wonder why not more commentators or scholars talk about this aspect of the book of Revelation. It's either people are afraid or generally a low view of ecclesiology that makes us overlook these aspects. But we have to understand that the book of Revelation is also, among many things, a liturgy. At the beginning, John was in the Lord's day, and he was taken up in the Spirit to heaven. Much like how Paul says that when we gather to worship, we are taken up into heavenly places on the Lord's day. Jesus appears in heaven, and the hosts of heaven began to worship. They begin to praise and to sing. Jesus opens the book, and the pastor, who is like John, have eaten the book, ingested the book, studied the book through the course of the week, begins to speak its content to us. The book of Revelation teaches us something important about heaven as well. We saw in the beginning that heaven wasn't static, it has a history. But there's something more specific we can say about it. Heaven is where things happen first, where future has already taken place. Jesus is not yet king here on earth, but he is acknowledged as king on heaven. Jesus is not yet enthroned here on earth, but he is enthroned in heaven. The world is not yet filled with praise, but heaven is filled with praise. And each week on the Lord's day, we enter into heaven. We ascend and we enter into a place where the future has already begun to take place. And then we are sent back out as people who have tasted the future, people who have seen the future, people who have touched the future, so that we could bring the future of God to bear on the world around us. Revelation is a liturgy, and it teaches us about our own worship, about what it means to worship in heavenly places. Again, much like prayer, we might often become disinterested with Sunday worship, but Revelation often opens up the veil of our eyes and shows us the majestic reality of our own worship that we took for granted. Now we enter into one of the most hotly debated or mostly talked about segment, which is the battle against the harlot. Now, in Revelation 17, the beginning of the third vision, which ends the book of Revelation, the vision of two women, a harlot, a false bride, and then the true bride, the heavenly Jerusalem. But the question is, who is this harlot that John sees in the third vision? Many reader concludes that this harlot is Rome, because she is dressed in finery. She's unfaithful. She sits on top of a beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. But I think that's a misreading, however. I don't think the harlot city is Rome. The harlot city sits at the back of the beast that represents Rome. But remember, again, the beast is meant to represent Rome. The description of the beast also fits the description of Rome. Rome is literally called the Septimontium, the city of 7 hills with 10 imperial province. And Rome is not Rome is the beast, but he is not the harlot city. The harlot city is Jerusalem. She's not just dressed with fine clothing. She's dressed specifically like a priest, wearing the color scarlet, like in Exodus 28 verse 5. She even has a plate on her head with an inscription. The priests in the temple has the same plate, but there have the inscription of Holy to Yahweh in Exodus 28 verse 36. But the Babylon has an inscription that shows her devotion to her God, which is herself. Her inscription says, Babylon the Great, mother of harlots. She is a priestly city. And the final clue comes in Revelation 18 verse 24. This description matches exactly of Jerusalem in the series of woes that Jesus gave in Matthew 23. And I'm gonna read it. In Revelation 18, verse 24, it said that in her was found the blood of the prophets and of the saints and of all who have been slain on earth. Now, of course, again, I would note to you that this is the same as the end of the series of woes Jesus gave to Israel in Matthew 23, verse, I'm going to read from, 35 to 38, not 25. It said that, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel, the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. And then he goes on to say, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. So that again, that is the final clue, and I think that's the most definitive clue. That this is the description. This is matching the final woes of Jesus at the end of Matthew. In Ezekiel 16 verse 35-37, Israel is also described as a prostitute. Yahweh says, therefore, O prostitute, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord God, because your lust was poured out and your nakedness uncovered in your whorings with your lovers and with all your abominable idols, and because of the blood of your children that you gave to them, therefore, behold, I will gather all your lovers with whom you took pleasures, and all those you loved, and all those you hated. I will gather them against you from every side, and will uncover your nakedness to them, that they may see all your nakedness. We see that as well in Hosea 1-3, where Yahweh specifically uses a harlot to describe his relationship with Israel. And so, Israel is always the prostitute. Hosea is told to marry a harlot, and this mimics Yahweh's relationship with Israel. And the question now becomes, you might ask, what is Jerusalem doing riding on Rome? We actually don't need to go far to see where that took place. In John 19, Jesus' trial before Pontius Pilate, we read, they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. There is your harlot, riding on the beast, the Jewish persecutors riding upon the Roman Empire. Now, of course, that's not all that Jesus is revealing, because now Jesus will reveal the harlot's fall. The harlot city is going to drink the wine wrath of God. She's going to get drunk. And like all the city in the Old Testament who drink from the cup of Yahweh's wrath, the city will eventually become unsteady and topple. The wine wrath that the city is drinking is the blood of the martyrs. And it is because the martyrs have not loved their life even unto death, the city falls. And we cry out, "Fallen is Babylon." This is a great encouragement to martyrs everywhere. Their blood is not forgotten. The Lord remembers that blood, and that blood will bring down the harlot cities and the monsters of our own time. The fall of the harlot, though, is followed by one of the longest chapters in the book of Revelation. It's a chapter of lament, where the kings of the earth, the merchants who trade with the harlot city, and the shipmasters who trade with the harlot city all mourn the fall of Babylon. Now, it's a strangely long chapter, and it doesn't need to be that long. It seems like it doesn't need to be that long. But remember, John at the beginning of Revelation also quotes the book of Zechariah. He talks about the mourning of those who see the one whom they pierced. That also seems to be about Jesus. But as we read the book of Revelation, Jesus has already been pierced. The ones who are pierced, who are seen to be pierced in the book of Revelation, are the martyrs. I think that's what John is telling us at the beginning of the book. Once the martyrs are fallen, once the martyrs are killed, they will see whom they pierced, and there will be mourning and lamentation. Then that's what we have in Revelation chapter 18. The lamentation of those who traded with those who are a part of the harlot city. They are now standing away from the city. They recognize the justice that God has meted out against the city. They aren't yet in the kingdom, but they've removed themselves from Babylon, and they see the suffering of the martyrs, and they mourn because they mourn over those whom they have pierced. I think, again, that's what we see towards the end of Revelation. It's a picture of a kind of liminal status that many of the Jews in the first century are in. They are no longer associated with the harlot city. They've removed themselves from the harlot city, but not yet associated with the heavenly bride, with the New Jerusalem that comes from heaven. That's where Revelation leaves Judaism. Many Jews in that in-between state, lamenting over the fall of the bride, recognizing God's justice, but not yet ready to acknowledge Jesus as Messiah. Now it's interesting. In the book of Revelation, if the book of Revelation was a Hollywood movie, we would be expecting a great confrontation between the true Lamb and the counterfeit Trinity, the dragon, the sea, and the land beast. We'd expect some kind of final battle, like in Avengers or in Star Wars, where Darth Vader faces against Luke. But strangely in Revelation, that never happened. The Lamb is never even in the same place with the beast and the dragon. But by the time the Lamb appears in Revelation 19, the feat has already taken place. He comes as a rider on a white horse. He comes as a conqueror. But the conquest has already been won, and we immediately see a triumphal procession. Revelation is about the victory of Jesus, but Jesus doesn't win this victory directly or single-handedly. Jesus wins the victory through the saints as they become faithful witnesses. Jesus triumphs, and the saints share in that triumph. The saints are given the unlimited privilege to be used by Jesus to win the victory, not only to join in the sufferings of Christ, but eventually enters into his victory as well. And then we enter into a vision of the millennium, that at the end the dragon, Satan, is cast into the abyss. He is prevented from deceiving the nations again, and that marks the beginning of the millennium. First, the dragon is chained and now is limited in his power. The dragon is not yet completely eliminated, but he will be eliminated when he is thrown into the lake of fire in chapter 20. But he is prevented specifically from deceiving the nations in the context of Revelation. That means that he is prevented to do what he did in the book of Revelation again. Jesus will not allow that to happen again during the millennium. The other thing that characterizes the millennium is the reign of the saints. They are seen ruling on thrones. The 24 elders we saw earlier in the book cast their crowns to give up their rule, and is being replaced now by those who witness the death and receive the crowns and the thrones. The millennium is said to have begun with the defeat of the harlot, the defeat of the beast, and it began shortly after John receives the vision. It began in 70 AD, and we've been living in the millennium ever since the fall of the old world. That's the good news of Revelation, that Jesus' victory is not ahead of us. Jesus has won the victory and has ushered in the new world under the rule of the martyrs. With the millennium ending, we enter into Revelation chapter 21, which is, as our John has read, the day itself. If you read in Revelation 21, we can see clearly that it is the eternal state. Actually, let me read myself, verse 1 until 8. Revelations 21. Yeah, 21 verse 1. Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Also there was no more sea. Then I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from heaven, saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. God himself will be with them, and be their God, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. Then he who sat on the throne said, Behold, I make all things new. And he said to me, Write, for these words are true and faithful. And he said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give the fountain of water of life freely to him who thirsts, and he who overcomes shall inherit all things. And I will be his God, and he shall be my son. But the cowardly, unbelieving, abominable, murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. This, again, like I said, is clearly describing the eternal state, where there are no more tears, no more sickness, and no more pain. And so, with the millennium ending, we enter into this vision of the final state, where John sees a new heaven and a new earth. He sees a new Jerusalem descend like a bride. This is Eden recovered, but not just recovered. This is Eden glorified. Eden is coming into perfection, where there is no more tears and no more death. This is the final product of the whole book of Revelation. The first Adam was cut open, and his rib was taken out to form Eve, so that they could be one flesh. And we see throughout the book of Revelation, as the last Adam, the Son of Man, along with the saints, are torn in two, and so a new Eve, a greater Eve, can be formed. The new Jerusalem as the bride of Jesus, to become one with the Lamb. Now, seems like we could end. It seems like we could end at Revelation 21, verse 8. But there's another vision. Remember, there's a fourth vision. John is caught up again in the Spirit, and he sees a vision of the same city. It's a city that looks the same. It's like a bride, the sign that's descending from heaven. It's another feminine city, and John gives us the measurement of the city, and it's the same sanctuary city. It is as high as it is wide, as it is long. But the problem is that this cannot be the eternal state. This cannot be the eternal heaven, because there are still nations outside the city. There are still kings bringing their riches into the city. In chapter 22, the leaves from the trees inside the city is given out to heal the nations. This is not the eternal state, because by then all those outside the city will be in the lake of fire. There will be no need for healing, because there is no more sickness, and there are no nations. There are no other people outside the city. That's the eternal state. But again, like I said, 21 verse 9 onward is not the eternal state. And I know this is tough for people to accept it, as it was for me the first time I read it through and truly understand. But you have to understand that this is actually an image of the church as it is on earth. Now you might be asking, but it says new heavens and new earth. Well, look at these few Old Testament passages. For example, Isaiah 51 verse 16. He says, "And I have put my words in your mouth and covered you in the shadow of my hand, establishing the heavens and laying the foundations of the earth, and saying to Zion, you are my people." This passage is talking about God coming into new covenant with Israel. And he refers to coming into a new covenant with Israel as establishing a new heaven and a new earth. We read Isaiah 65 verse 17 to 18. "For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth. For the former things shall not be remembered nor come to mind, but be glad and rejoice forever in that which I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem to be a joy, and her people to be a gladness." God, in this context, is divorcing the covenant breakers in Isaiah's day and coming into a new covenant with the faithful Jerusalem. He says to the covenant breakers, "You're going to be hungry, my people will eat. You're going to be thirsty, my people will drink." He says, "I'll call my people by a new name. Behold, I'm creating new heavens and new earth." And John now mimics that language in Revelation chapter 21. Now, you might still not be convinced, but again, how about some themes from biblical theology? You remember that John is on a high mountain in this vision. He's not the first prophet to be placed on a high mountain to see a heavenly pattern. Moses was the first. Moses was on a mountain and he sees a vision of the tabernacle when he went down and he told his people to build the tabernacle. Ezekiel was also placed in a great and high mountain, and then he sees a vision of the new temple, a vision of a new creation coming after the exile from Babylon. David sees a vision, another heavenly pattern, and then he tells Solomon to build the temple. All these prophets previously sees a blueprint of what they're supposed to make on earth. It's the same message we see at the end of Revelation. John goes up on a high mountain, he sees a heavenly pattern, and this pattern shows us what we are supposed to be building on earth. This is the vision that lays out our hope for the future. It's not a future where we become the great minority and Jesus' reign becomes so faint that it's practically invisible. But instead, this great city where the nations are healed and the kings of the earth lays up treasure upon God's city, the church. And you might be saying, "Marco, it sure doesn't look like it now. We got the Rona, we can't even go to Sunday to worship yet," and all these things are happening. But which I'll remind you that all of this, all that we have now, me creating this video, you watching this, you learning the scripture, you having a Bible of your own in your hand, all this began with 11 very confused disciples and a recently murdered man in Palestine. But yet here we are now. We're gathering and we're learning still as God's people. And this is global. Back then when the church was just a small Jewish cult, now the church is everywhere. You can look up on the internet and see commentaries upon commentaries. People talking about the Word of God. The Bible is still the highest selling book in all of history. The most translated one as well. There are more churches in KL than there ever was in 1st century Asia Minor. If anyone in 1st century ever sees the churches in Malaysia, they would probably go, "Surely that must be the New Jerusalem." Now, again, if this is true, then I hope that the Spirit is changing your perspective, because I know it radically changed mine before, where before it was a mindset of escapism, where it's like, to hell with the world, it's going to hell in a handbasket, why bother polishing brass on a sinking ship? And because of that, we became like Gnostics, who think that this world is beyond redemption. Now, hopefully, that is altered, that mindset is now altered, and you go, Jesus was right. The meek will inherit the earth. He is going to have a dominion, and he is going to bring justice into the world. All authority on earth and on heaven has been given to him, and now he tells me to go win the nations. I have the Spirit, the gospel that brings life into the world. I have the leaf and the waters that will heal the nations and bring salvation. Now I got some work to do. Maybe I will take care of my relationship with my family. Maybe now I will raise up my children. And maybe even adopt some kids here and there and disciple them in love and admonition of the Lord, because I need to have a legacy for the gospel. The gospel can't simply end at my generation. Maybe I should respond to the injustices all around the world, all around me, and begin to fight the darkness around the world with the light of the gospel. God is going to put all of Jesus' enemy under his feet until the last enemy is to be destroyed is death. And he will do this through his saints. That's essentially the end of the book of Revelation. And so the book of Revelation doesn't just end with "Come Lord Jesus." It actually ends with a command. It's a command to go and become the new heavenly Jerusalem, to go and be the water, the leaf that brings healing to the nations, and the nations then bring up their treasures and lay them up on the heavenly city. And so the question becomes, how do we know Christ's reign? How can we know how Christ will reign during this time? How can we fulfill this image of the idealized church, of the new heaven, the new earth that we see in Revelation 21? And hopefully this will tie back into the final session that we will have on our series of eschatology. We will go into key passages on eschatology like Psalm 110:1 to see how God will reign through his saints in creating the new heaven and the new earth. And so hopefully this has been a blessing to you. This has been quite tough for me to make. I hope you appreciate it. I hope this becomes an encouragement for you to go back into the book of Revelation and study this wonderful book that sadly people often just don't read or awfully misread. And yeah, that becomes my prayer, and I hope that God bless you in your studies. That's all from my end. Let me close this.